Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Master Sanders to continue and finish our series on the religious right in the United States. So, Master Sanders, why don't you open up with your thoughts on the future of the religious right?
Well, to put it frankly, I would say that the Christian right is dead. Now, you might say, like, well, there's still organizations that are actively engaged in politics. There's still activist organizations, still individuals that play up their religious connections. Of course, that's true. But the days where people of faith, especially on the right, being viewed as serious actors in the political and cultural arena, I think is effectively gone. You could argue that there was a trend toward this for a very long time, especially in the years after President Bush, the younger. But even during the time of Trump, I was thinking that Trump was probably going to be the last hurrah for the religious right. Even outside commentators have noted that the religious right has shifted in its rhetoric. So if you listen to the 80s, you'd have people like Jerry Falwell and others on this idea of a moral majority, right? Like, because even non-Christians would agree with us on these issues. Whereas nowadays, there's much more of a minoritarian perspective where they're trying to argue for religious rights and exemptions. So even with the change in rhetoric and the change in strategy, I think it's become very clear that many people on the Christian right view that they're dwindling in terms of numbers and influence. And especially in recent times, as we're seeing a number of different, prominent, I guess you could say, apostasies or defections from mainstream center-right evangelical circles is happening with greater and greater frequency, or at least in terms of prominence. It shows you that this sort of cultural milieu in which the religious right came to be is disintegrating. And whether or not you believe Trump lost fair and square, or whether he lost by rather dubious means, uh, given the fact that it's been done once, it kind of it doesn't bode well for the future of a future religious right candidate. Even if Trump manages to get reelected in 2024, these everything that happened with the Capitol Hill incident and all these other personality issues with Donald Trump are going to stick with conservative Christians. And so any pretense of being a force for morality and decency in the public sphere has been gone. And so it's going to be interesting to see what these groups in modern Christian, right-wing Christian evangelical circles are going to be doing in the next couple of years, because I don't really see their options are good ones if they wish to continue this line of activism.
Yeah, one thing that sort of seems to be the result is the religious right, I think, really has changed from having both of us having grown up within the milieu of it. What they stood for, these moral social issues, or what we might call broadly these social issues, they've certainly distanced themselves from in recent years. They've trended towards, and this is something we've seen with other dissident groups. Though I don't know if we call the religious right a dissident group yet, but this idea of using libertarianism as a kind of dog whistle and umbrella to avoid being directly attacked for your beliefs by the secular left. So a lot of people would identify with libertarianism because it created this space of, this is my property, this is my space, this is the rules that I impose on it. You can impose whatever rules you want on your space, but here on my space, these are my rules. And that's a way that you can argue with the secular left in a way without necessarily tipping your hand. Like the alt-right used to do that early on, and other groups like that. Neo-Confederates did that for a while. And I see that as a trend with the religious right today. But spoiler alert, that never works, because all of these groups who have tried to flirt with libertarianism and then gone under the radar with it have been jettisoned. I mean, a lot of people like that were in the Rothbard-Rockwell report in the 90s, which sort of came out and got Ron Paul in trouble in 2012, which kind of sunk any chances he had for an election campaign, and they largely got disowned. So, for example, Jared Taylor used to write for Lou Rockwell until Lou Rockwell booted him. And Bill Lynch used to write for Lou Rockwell until Lou Rockwell stopped inviting him to write articles. So it doesn't really work in the long run, but that seems to be the strategy they're trying right now. But it's not just a grift. I think also they've just really changed, because in the 80s and 90s, we had the patriarchy movement. And whether that was a hard patriarchy under like the Vision Forum, or at least what they styled themselves as a hard patriarchy, and then a more softer patriarchy, that's almost totally gone now. Like, a diehard like Doug Wilson, who still might quote, the Confederate theologian Robert Dabney, won't mention anything patriarchal anymore. And they sort of just conceded to this sort of like 1950s feminism, which doesn't at all correlate with what the religious right was originally teaching, right? It's now complementarianism versus egalitarianism, whereas back in the 80s and 90s, there was patriarchy, egalitarianism, and complementarianism. And so the complete abandonment of any sort of patriarchal theology, I think, really shows a decisive shift in the religious right, in the way they're going. And they're going in a more libertarian direction right now. And I think part of it is as they became successful, they sort of got seduced by the power and the wealth and prestige and privilege that they were getting. And they were getting some. But then as the political tide shifted, they started to lose it, but they weren't willing to give up what they already had. And in order to keep what they already had, I think is what led them to fundamentally shift in their outlook on all these issues.
Exactly. And that's the sort of bug, not a feature aspect of the Christian right when it comes to this degrading of their initial stances, or this downgrade of some of their stances. Arguably goes back to the very beginning, even further than that, like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when you have sort of libertarianism begin to emerge in the wake of the Cold War and the New Deal. And even people like Rushdoony were hobnobbing with some of these circles, with groups like the Volcker Fund that were funding people like him and Rothbard and others. What the religious right, especially in the 70s and 80s, came out of this milieu of fusionism, where where socially conservative values were wedded to more or less market liberalism. And it seems like only a matter of time before the effects of market liberalism would infect the Christian right. And arguably, that's probably what has opened the door to all sorts of other problems within the church. As we talked about before, things such as feminism and progressivism haven't come into the conservative churches through the front door. They've come through the back door. And they came through the back door just based on economic realities. For example, you're talking about with patriarchy. That used to be much more of a tenable position among evangelical Christians. But things such as the way that our economy is, also there are more and more people that are more and more women, especially, becoming integrated into the economy, where you've had to have two-income houses just to maintain some level of a standard of living. And all these concerns with money have sort of worn down traditional arguments against, say, things like birth control, where now birth control is accepted as, something that's responsible because you may not be able to afford it economically, or feminism. It may not be like an ideological feminism, but it's a practical feminism where women are encouraged to go to college and have a career for a couple of years before they get married and settle down. So these things have already infiltrated the right to the point where they don't really have an effective witness. And we even see now, even among the more quote-unquote woke evangelicals, which in large part, they still come out of the conservative evangelical culture. But I think a lot of their concerns that, especially when it comes to race and now even gender and sexuality, seem to be driven by economic factors as well, to maintain their organizations, to maintain their standing, to not look like they're people that are against, or people that are against popular trends. In fact, they seem to be wanting to get on those trends. So, yeah, I think you could argue that the religious right imploding on this because of the compromises that they've made with their alliances isn't so much a bug as it is a feature dating back all the way just after World War II.
Well, and this does get back to the devil's bargain made with Mammon with the broader conservative movement in general, when, the alliance with the libertarian movement, because this idea of like a conservative libertarian alliance forming the National Review consensus, goes back to right to the start. And at the end of the day, the religious conservative lost. The corporation, as we see now, has all these guarantees and protections and is able to run roughshod over the country. But the religious right is, or the religious conservative is powerless and a laughingstock. They gained nothing from the alliance. Now, one could argue in pragmatic terms that, well, still that was better than losing and being liquidated by the communists, and one can make arguments for and against that. But certainly at this point, it's long since past time to give up on this alliance. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked out for us. If it ever made sense at any time in the past, it doesn't now. And it just needs to be torpedoed, because it's and we see this with Constantine in the church as well. Whenever the church makes common cause with worldly institutions, whether it's the state or corporations or the university or other, just any general worldly institution, there are changes that go both ways. But at the end of the day, if you look at the ledger, more changes affect the church than the worldly institution. And unfortunately, that means the church then loses out. And so we see, the trajectory of the state church that Constantine set up, and almost all rhetoric against Christianity is directed at these state church excesses that Constantine helped facilitate. And by the same token, almost all the criticism of the religious right is in part because of the religious rights and religious conservatives' embracing of political and economic power in the late 20th century. And they didn't get anything for it. And so, they need to look long and hard in the mirror and realize that this alliance doesn't work. And not only does it not work, but if you, especially the New Testament, right? Because, we're going to bring up theonomy a little bit later, but most evangelical Christians are not theonomists. Most of them would at least give lip service to being red letter Christians, what Jesus said in the New Testament. Literally nothing Jesus said in the New Testament would even remotely indicate he was an entrepreneur, a capitalist, or any sort of money lender, anybody dealing in buying and selling of goods or the exchange or the production of currency. In fact, everything Jesus says is highly critical of property and money and power. He tells the rich young ruler to sell all that he has, give to the poor. When Zacchaeus sells all that he has, Christ says salvation has come to this house. Acts 2 and 4, the Christians are praised for selling their possessions to the church. And Ananias and Sapphira are struck dead by God because they withheld some of their money, some of their resources. Christ says you can't serve God and mammon. He has the parable of the prudent businessman who built up a barn to store his resources in order to retire and ease in luxury. And of course, he dies and he doesn't get to use it, which of course I think is an homage to Solomon, where Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, why toil for gain when it then passes on to someone else who might just squander it, after you're dead. It's vanity. And while it's certainly wrong to view Jesus as a socialist or the early church as socialist, there's lots of reasons, not the least of it, it's completely anachronistic. I think it's a much easier mistake to forgive, because superficially, Jesus and the early church seem to have a lot more in common with the doctrines of socialism on a very surface level reading. But Jesus a capitalist, Jesus a moneylender, Jesus a entrepreneur is just ludicrous. There's absolutely nothing in the Gospels and in Paul's epistles and the Catholic epistles that would give any indication that Jesus was inclined towards any of those things.
Well, absolutely. And that's, again, this a lot of what modern evangelicalism is. It's built on a business model, whether it's a church, whether it's a parachurch organization, whether it's a business or what have you. A lot of it is geared toward maximizing profit, usually pandering toward a certain niche. But even so, being not willing to deal with certain topics because that could offend certain members of your base. And you and I have, Todd, have seen that with other Christians that have refused to engage certain topics because of that reason. But shifting gears a bit, I think that we can't really talk about the current state of evangelicalism without understanding the sort of theological landscape at this point. Now, beginning in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, we see the resurgence of Calvinism, especially in the area of soteriology, where we have what some people call the New Calvinism or Young, Restless, and Reformed. That was very popular among people in our generations, especially millennials, that were fed up with the sort of emptiness of the 80s and 90s, Christianity, that tended to be very surface level, tended to be closer to sort of a therapeutic moral deism, as one put it. And you can kind of see why initially it did have a lot of popularity, because it promised to be this sort of robust and rigorous theology that was going to have answers in a way this sort of superficial Christianity did not. The problem is, though, is that this itself became a trend. This itself became a commercial model. And today, virtually, outside of charismatic circles, of course, but virtually uh, every major institution, and whether it comes to denominations or parachurch organizations, either are outright Calvinist or they pander to Calvinism. And so it's sort of, we've seen the triumph, especially in groups such as the Southern Baptist Convention, of Calvinism. But it's at this point, especially in the years around beginning like 2015 onward, where we begin to see fissures break within the broader Calvinist world. And I think you could really break it down to sort of three major groups. And again, you got to keep in mind, all of these are ostensibly conservative. So you have the sort of woke crowd, people like, Tim Keller, to Matt Chandler, Russell Moore, to a lesser extent, John Piper, maybe even Al Mohler, depending on what day it is, where they've conceded on a lot of these issues on race, where they seem to repeat a lot of talking points that are very popular within sort of mainstream culturally liberal discourse, although they may say that they want to distance themselves from critical race theory as such. They've nevertheless borrowed it, a lot of the language of it, and have even on occasion have said it can be a useful tool. Then you have sort of what I call the boomer/dispensationalist Calvinists. These are the people that tend to center around John MacArthur. These people are, again, they're generally dispensationalist pre-mill types that was popular, I would say, in the 80s and 90s. They're Calvinist, but at times they're probably closer to Baptist in other areas, and are mostly right wing, but not to the same, but not necessarily as politically involved or care as much politically. People like John MacArthur, his right hand man Phil Johnson, Todd Friel, and probably on any given day, likely somebody like J.D. Hall, who is a bit more politically involved, but somebody who's very much represents the sort of Calvinistic Baptist dispensationalist sort of strain of the New Calvinism. And then you have the theonomists, people who may not have been part of the initial New Calvinism wave, but became integrated into it. And even so, they appeal to many of the same millennials and others that the other aspects of the New Calvinism appeal to. So people like Doug Wilson, people like Jeff Durbin, and James White. James White has moved more in that direction, in large part because of his affiliation with Jeff Durbin. And that's sort of the milieu that you see now, that they're all variations of Calvinism. Although in recent years, I think you could see with the actual battle lines, most of it's going to be probably between the theonomists and the woke Calvinists. I see those as the two factions that have the longest legs, so to speak. And that's probably why you've seen such acrimony in the New Calvinist community, is the fighting between both of these sides. And I think that's probably where the future of Calvinism lies. I think after John MacArthur dies, I think a lot of his followers will probably go to one or two of the other factions that I mentioned. But for the most part, yeah, I think it's probably going to be the woke Calvinists versus the theonomists.
Yeah, and it sounds like that the boomer Calvinists, because they are more of a generational identity, will be the first to go, just because they're a unique brand. Obviously, he's now deceased, but I think R.C. Sproul Sr. would have fit perfectly in that category as well. And despite how we've also dunked on boomers in numerous talks of ours, I think the boomer Calvinists were the most respectable and had some of the best teaching. Sproul and MacArthur were and are still, I think, excellent teachers on many areas. But the problem is even they compromised on points which made it possible for this to happen today. And I think what's with the woke Calvinists, I mean, one of the problems that's going to happen, and we've already seen this with this Paul Maxwell guy, they're just going to stop being Christian altogether and just merge into the woke Borg. You know, they're just going to merge into it and leave the church. So one of the problems that these woke Calvinists are going to have is that their people are just going to leave. And what's, I think, interesting about the Paul Maxwell incident is that he was a very well-respected, influential, proto-woke Calvinist. I don't know if he was quite woke yet, because a lot of his work that people point to was before this actually rolled out. Obviously, I think there's something dodgy about Paul Maxwell right out of the gate. In his YouTube channel, he sort of positioned himself as a sort of edgy, right-wing Christian giving sex advice, kind of a discount Darlock. But then he goes dark for a couple years, and then he starts writing about trauma from like a liberal perspective. I'm like, yeah, something is obviously very fishy about that. And the fact that he doesn't tell us what that is, I'm not surprised this happened, because that shift right there was already very suspicious. But they're just going to lose people, because the more they compromise with the world woke agenda, the more indistinguishable they become. And second of all, it's not going to appease the woke agenda. They're still going to be seen as white oppressors. They're still going to be seen as, Christianity's still going to be seen as an oppressive religion by these people. And at best, they're going to buy time. But for what? They're till their own, termination by the woke establishment. But I think also they're just going to have a lot of people bleeding away. And it will be interesting to speculate what will happen when guiding lights like Tim Keller and John Piper die. I mean, they are a geriocracy. Who are the young people? Well, the young people are actually leaving. That's the thing, right? Like Paul Maxwell. They're leaving. So any young leaders of these woke churches are just going to end up leaving. And when the diehards die, it's difficult to see how they're going to maintain any sort of cohesion and unity into the future. With the theonomist right-wing Calvinists, I think you're right. They're going to pick up a lot of people from the boomer Calvinists. They might even pick up people from the woke Calvinists who see that group just melting away. And I think, again, Jeff Durbin might be the gateway for that, because he's definitely he's actually been accused of going woke recently. And I think he's been accused of going woke because he's doing a rhetorical shift in order to reach out to that side of the Calvinist debate. Because I do think Jeff Durbin wants to create this Calvinist consensus, or, a Calvin hub, where like all the Calvinist thinkers, all the Calvinist works over the last 30 years are all in this one location, more or less under his aegis. And he's, of course, firmly in the theonomist camp. And I think what we're going to see with the theonomists is a confrontation with... Now, this does depend on who is president at the time. If we have a right-wing president, a conservative president who does some draconian state measures, the civil disobedience will come from the woke Calvinists. The same people that told the Americans, to take the vaccine, quarantine yourself because it was Biden, told them to resist Trump, right? But by the same token, if it's Biden doing this, you could easily see these right-wing Calvinists engaging in civil disobedience against the authorities there. And depending on how far they want to push this, you could easily see this spiraling out of control into a kind of Calvinist Charlottesville, where, again, in Charlottesville, only one person died. So I'm not saying a lot of people are going to die. I'm just saying that they're going to get into some big trouble with the law enforcement, and it could torpedo them, and just like the alt-right, they could have all their accounts terminated on social media, and they could be just blacklisted from the internet. And I think that is one real possibility for them, especially as they pursue a more bellicose direction towards the civil magistrate, which again is violating theonomy, but whatever.
Well, exactly. And before we go any further on that, I think we need to try to understand, like, why have we experienced this resurgence in theonomy in recent years. Now, we've talked about theonomy and dominionism in the past. One of the biggest problems that theonomy had early on was personality. So in a weird way, the theonomy movement in the late 20th century blew up before it could really get started, in large part because of personality issues between people like Rushdoony and North. Bonson was sort of his own thing, which Bonson did a lot to destroy his own credibility through his behavior. And so, by the time that, I don't remember if it was Christianity Today, it probably was, but some major Christian magazine basically did a hit piece on the Christian Reconstruction movement. It was already in its death throes before, and which for something that did have a lot of subtle influence in areas of the Christian right, it is very interesting that in and of itself, Christian Reconstruction had a very limited shelf life. And so it seemed like issues of biblical law and its application to the present seems to have fallen off a bit. Or it seemed to have up until, I would say, the 2010s, where you have people like, Doug Wilson gain sort of an ascendancy, and of course, Jeff Durbin as well. I think the attraction of theonomy is purely the aesthetics that men like Wilson and even Durbin, which may at first seem opposed, but these men have been very good at cultivating an aesthetic and an image that theonomy, especially if their variety is very muscular, it's very active. It's not a Christianity that says we need to hide under the table and wait for the bombs to fall. It's a purportedly optimistic version of Christianity, as opposed to the pessimistic premillennialism of their boomer parents. And so I think it's those sorts of things that promise to be much more rigorous, promises to be much more biblical, masculine, and active. I think that's what draws a lot of millennials, especially millennial men, many of whom get confusing signals as what masculinity means from the culture. I think that's the draw of theonomy. I think that's why they're drawn to people like, Doug Wilson, who talks about the virtues of sexism, or Jeff Durbin, who's this guy with tattoos and who's taken on people like the police or mayors or what have you. The problem is that it's aesthetics. I think if you actually dig down deep into what theonomists actually believe, or at least this generation of theonomists believe, it's not really that different than the fusionist conservative consensus that came down. In fact, if anything, it's probably a little bit to the left of them, at least on cultural issues, because I don't think people like Rushdoony or North would necessarily be eager to encourage women to go to school, like in terms of like university or college or anything after grade school. So I think, but they are very good at maintaining the image and pushing the brand, and I think that's why a lot of Calvinists that grew up with Piper, that grew up with Keller and Chandler, that might be a bit more disaffected when they see their heroes going woke. Somebody like Wilson, who used to hang out with these very people at things like the Gospel Coalition, when Piper basically invited him to a seat at the table. I think you're going to see people like Durbin and Wilson pick up these people, offering them something that looks on the surface very substantive, but is not really that different from the evangelicalism they left behind.
Yeah, exactly. And what also needs to be understood is that there's been a progressive series of watering downs of theonomy. A guest on here frequently, Keith Preston, has mentioned this to me in private, that when you read Rushdoony and you read North, it's very hardcore. Like, they talk about stoning people straight up. They don't make any excuses. All these other things. It's very hardcore. And then you get people like Peter J. Lightheart and James B. Jordan, who sort of left the Tyler, Texas crowd and start to water it down a bit. And then you get to another iteration of a spike in theonomy until the scandal revolving around Doug Phillips' Vision Forum. But they also had a kind of watered down theonomy. They'd mention Rushdoony, they'd say read Rushdoony, but a lot of the sort of like Old Testament case law stuff, they were not as open about. And as far as economics goes, again, North has always been a hyper-capitalist. He's been involved with the Mises crowd, which is probably why he takes that angle. But I'm not sure that Rushdoony took a necessarily hyper-capitalist position. He probably was conventionally free market because he was writing during the Cold War. He died like in 2003, I think. But he wasn't like a hyper-capitalist like today, at least not from my reading or experience of Rushdoony. And then finally, we have now, this current like Wilson Durbin iteration, which is even more watered down. So theonomy is progressively watered down and redefined. And that then brings the question of a lot of its critics, what exactly is theonomy? It's like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Which one of the 613 laws of Moses are we supposed to keep? I remember when I was listening to during the sort of interim period between the collapse of Vision Forum and the rise of Doug Wilson and Jeff Durbin, a podcast, if you will, or a radio program, if you will, by a little-known theonomist out in Colorado, and he interviewed this woman whose family didn't eat pork because she said it violated the law. And he's like, well, that's a debate within theonomy. I'm like, really? I mean, you can't even figure that one out? I mean, it's like, well, which is it? And again, I think the bigger problem with theonomy is, well, in a purely analytical sense, in order to analyze the Old Testament, it might be helpful to speak of the three parts of the law: the civil, the moral, and the cultic. In a purely analytical sense, I can accept that as a tool of analysis. But it's not real. There is no... The law is a seamless garment. You can't... Moses said, cursed is the man who does not keep everything written in this book. And Paul reiterates that in his epistles. So you can't treat the law as these like compartmentalized spaces that you can just kind of shift around as modules, which is exactly what theonomy does. Which is funny, right? Because that's actually a medieval development in theology, a Catholic development in theology. And these are people that posture themselves as like, the arch reformers rejecting all papal innovation. Well, not quite, as it turns out. And again, it creates this theoretical framework from which they operate, which leads to all sorts of confusion, because now if you get to pick and choose which parts of the law you're going to keep, well, that leads to an unending debate, which, as we see, is not yet resolved. And so I think the real problem with theonomy is just how amorphous it is, how it changes all the time, how it's continually watered down. I mean, I would not be surprised if a future generation of theonomists take the squishy position of Tim Keller and call it theonomy at some point.
I think you're right. In fact, we talked about this before with Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson adheres to what he calls a general equity theonomy, which is a phrase that's taken from, I believe, the Westminster Confession. And basically what it is that, the theory behind general equity is that the laws that are shown in the Torah are meant for a specific historical and cultural context, but that doesn't mean that those principles that are behind them are no longer applicable, right? So, it's sort of like certain theories of law where you have certain principles and then you apply them in specific cases. The problem is that that's what that does is it makes abstract the very specific and exacting laws that was prescribed to the Israelites through Moses. And you're right. There's no indication that there's a separation or a distinction of, these artificial categories between the laws. In fact, we see even repeated throughout the New Testament, as you mentioned, breaking the law, even in one aspect, is guilty of breaking all of it. Right. And so then it gets to that point, as even somebody like J.D. Hall has mentioned, it's like, then general equity theonomy is not theonomy. It's not theonomy. There's no, because they don't say that we have to follow this specific rule. It's just this amorphous principle that's behind that rule, which is really much open to interpretation. And you kind of get in this sort of Pharisaism where, it's the principle of the thing which applies to all these other areas, as opposed to what the law actually says. And so, theonomy at this stage, it's not an attempt to offer concrete solutions for society or the church. It's an aesthetic, right? You identify with a certain aesthetic coming, that you're supposedly you're a better Christian because you hold to a specific type of theonomy, I guess, or you hold to theonomy. You believe that the law, the commands of God are universal and applicable for all time. But when it comes to your personal life, you don't apply any of them, if any of them, right? Even at this point, people like they would mock, like the Hebrew Roots movement, do a far better job at trying to apply these laws practically than the theonomists do. But nevertheless, because these theonomists insist that they hold to the law of God, they're going to draw a lot of, again, naive Calvinists, and I think even some naive non-Calvinists into their sphere, because they're going to be looking like the far more rigorous, far more biblical, serious, strict version of evangelicalism that's very much missing today.
Yeah, and in a lot of regards too, I think that theonomy was never really serious, because one of the subcultures within theonomy was kinism, which I guess never really went away, but it was always just a small group anyhow, and never really got any traction. And they were tired of what they saw as the Tyler, Texas crowd, race cooking all the time. And they emphasize the sort of clannish tribal nature of the law and the Old Testament, which, if you read the law in the Old Testament, it's really hard to argue against. And the mainstream Tyler, Texas crowd just never touched it. For a while, Doug Wilson would touch it. He was often, at least informally, often accused of being a Confederate sympathizer and racist and all that. But eventually, he came out against kinism as well. And it's like, well, I mean, if you're just going to do that, how are you different than Tim Keller in principle, right? You may not hammer it all the time like Tim Keller does, but you're not really intrinsically different. So they might have been onto something when they called the theonomists out for that. But I guess back to the woke Calvinist, the problem with that is that we can talk about the theonomists being maybe misguided, maybe being corrupt, but this is just straight up antichrist. I mean, the wokeism, the sort of like Marxist ideology that they've ended up embracing. Tim Keller is on record as having defended the Russian revolutionaries. I mean, it's difficult to imagine a Christian pastor defending Lenin, but there's a sermon where he defends the Russian communists. It really is a sight to see. That would be like if Doug Wilson came up and defended Adolf Hitler. I mean, you can't imagine that. But, that also begs the question, do these woke Christians have a death wish? And I'm not joking. I mean, I think, do they really have a death wish? Because the communists they hobnob with will kill them under the right or wrong, depending on your outlook, circumstances. And I do think that they aren't going to be able to deal with the hemorrhaging. A lot of these people are leaving. They're just becoming indistinguishable from the broader woke establishment, and more doors will open if you just ditch Christianity altogether. Which seems to be the case that, yeah, that's exactly what many of them are doing. And this is another thing too, right? Because not just Paul Maxwell, but there was a guy, I forget his name, who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye, also left.
Josh Harris.
And then the question is, were these people ever Christian in the first place? Were these people just grifting the whole time? And that's another very important question to ask. And even though we have our problems with conversations that matter, he did bring up a good point when dealing with this recent round of apostasy, which was, were there signs along the way that we could have seen that could have warned us? I never really followed Josh Harris, so I couldn't say one way or the other. But with Maxwell, yes, there were signs of bad faith acting. He might have been a bad faith actor from the very beginning. Again, that's a little hard to tell, but it does seem, though, that the woke church has opened itself to infiltration by non-Christians who are just grifting for money, or bad actors who were at best nominal Christian even when they were popular. And this sort of inability to gather quality people around them, and being this almost completely open cellular organism that just bleeds everywhere, makes it, I think, it survives only because it's riding the tidal wave of the current system. But that's just like their religious right back in the 1980s. And when this tide recedes, they'll be left high and dry. And I don't think they'll have much left. And in fact, they might have the broader society might view them much the same way they view the religious right.
Well, exactly, exactly. And I guess that goes back to the fundamental problem with evangelicalism is that whether it was the religious right in the 80s and 90s, or whether it's the trendy new Calvinism of the 2000s or the woke Calvinism of the 2010s and 2020s, a lot of it is financially driven. A lot of it is trying to be relevant because when you listen to these people, right, they say things like, we got to be listening to people. We can't be like cut off from the world. We can't be in a position where nobody takes us seriously. But when you see all the other stuff that they've done in the past, I think it becomes clear that this is in large part, as you mentioned, a grift. Is that since people have been leaving the church in larger numbers, the grift is not as easy to maintain anymore. So you have to widen your audience. The Southern Baptist Convention for example, has been bleeding members for the past 10 years, and this was even before like the really woke stuff started to kick in. I think a lot of people within the Southern Baptist establishment were thinking that we got to appeal to some of these people like millennials and others because they're the future. That so much so, but they missed the point in doing so. They think by reaching millennials they have to appeal to millennial sensibilities, and while that may work for a time, in the end, the millennials that are drawn by those millennial sensibilities are going to leave anyway, and they're going to just join the world. Right, like your Paul Maxwell's and your Josh Harris's, people who just want to fit in. They want to live a certain lifestyle that the church doesn't let them. And I remember even reading, I don't remember if I think this was the American Spectator. This guy who was talking about some of the scandals that's going on at Hillsong. While he grew up, I think, in a sort of trendy Calvary Chapel or charismatic church, he had left, but what he was saying in the article is that if Christianity becomes the world with a twist of Christianity, then the world's not going to take it. The world is going to end up staying in the world because at least the world isn't telling you to abstain from premarital sex. If I can do all the things that I wanted to do and include all, like, in terms of my lifestyle, why would I join the church that would claim to do the same thing that I want to do but just put more restrictions on me? So this method of trying to reach out to the world and try to be relevant to the world, which is still even prevalent in the theonomists as much as it is in the woke crowd, it's only going to weaken our witness, and in the end, it's going to be the death of that movement, assuming that they don't change course and try to appeal to the next trend. And then it becomes, as you mentioned, it becomes obvious that these people are trend chasers and not people who are actually standing for truth. Oh, man, I had a point. I may get back to that later. Sorry.
Yeah, and that really is the point. They don't understand what success is or looks like or how to attain it. They have bought into this sort of like church growth model, which is based off of corporate doctrine. And as we see in the Bible, God does not want a large force necessarily. He wants a small, tightly organized elite force. Think of like Gideon and his 300 men. Think of all the times when he uses a small handful of men who are motivated and committed to overcome tremendous odds. God prefers motivated volunteers to duped conscripts, to use a military terminology. And a lot of these people don't get that. And also what they don't get is Nietzsche. Nietzsche pointed out that from the overman, the one person that is of a fascination to the overman is the life-denying ascetic, which he views all Christians as aspiring to. If we have this life-denying attitude, that is the attraction itself. That's why Nietzsche has to warn the overman to be careful not to be seduced by the life-denying ascetic, by the actual Christian. And so the point is you have to be different, but not just different for the sake of being different, different in the way that Christ and God's word tells you to be, in order to attract people to you in the first place. And to link with Aristotle says that friendships have to be built on something that is permanent, i.e. the love of the good. Otherwise, they'll be transient And that's why we see in modern age, the modern age, friendships being so transient. They're not based on some eternal virtuous core. And by the same token, the church that builds an identity on trends, ever shifting sand, will not be a church that lasts because it's not built on something that will last. The church that if the church wants to last, it needs to be built upon the cornerstone of Christ, because that is the foundation that will last. And they just assiduously refuse to do it. They do all of the things that they have no capability to actually perform: save the world, save the country, and poverty, and fill in your ism, things that are impossible. Because Christ told us the poor will always be with you. You can't solve these problems. The things that they can do: engage in spiritual discipline in their own life, disciple their children, disciple their wives, the elders discipling their congregation. Well, they're just not going to do that at all, because that's beneath me. And that's not really what a Christian needs to do anyhow, because it's not relevant. It's not engaging. And, it reminds me of the classical turn of phrase: the gods first make mad the one whom they seek to destroy. And I really think that's sort of where evangelicaldom is at the moment.
I think you're right. I remember the point I was going to make. I think you were saying that, Jeff Durbin appears to be going woke, at least in terms of the language. Well, we've already seen Doug Wilson doing that too, because whenever you listen to Doug Wilson, especially in regards to, let's say, like Black Lives Matter, in their attempt to reframe the discussion as something about abortion, they're utilizing the same language. Showing, there was a commercial you showed me from, I believe it was New St. Andrews College, where they were driving this exact line when they're talking about, his life matters and her life matters, and they're, I get what they were trying to do, but even so, it's still the acknowledge you're playing by the rules that they've set down. Even if you're trying to point out their hypocrisy, they've still won in a sense, because you're now trying to play their game rather than the other way around. But you're talking about trends, like, yeah, we've seen that where building your church on trends gets you. What was the hip and happening church in the 60s and 70s? Well, it was Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, which was pioneers of the seeker-sensitive movement. They were big supporters of Christian rock. And over time, though, we've seen that Willow Creek Church has a lot of staffing issues, to say the least, including like, Paul Hybels, who had to step down in disgrace because of his indiscretions. So, but yeah, the new Calvinism in and of itself, even though it was a reaction to a previous trendiness, it became a trend in and of itself. And I would say the woke Calvinism or the theonomic reaction are going to be trends in and of themselves as well. And because they are built on trends and business models, that's why you even see hardcore, quote unquote, hardcore people like Doug Wilson concede a lot of points that previous generations of evangelicals wouldn't. It's kind of hard to imagine, evangelicals of the 80s and 90s supporting some of the things that the modern theonomic movement supports today. I don't think Rushdoony would be particularly happy about women running a podcast or a radio show about theology. I don't think that would have happened at all. And so you do begin to wonder again if Doug Wilson, Jeff Durbin, or their theological successors will end up being just as woke as the people they criticized in the previous generation. And so the same problems that plague American political conservatism are soon going to plague religious conservatism as well.
Yeah. And I think the real problem, or at least maybe not the real problem, but a problem that will just continue to fester and develop until the dark predictions of Rod Dreher come true. And I think Rod Dreher is right. And he's the only mainstream figure saying this. So I guess, props to his courage to say this, that the state will become increasingly anti-Christian. He doesn't necessarily say there'll be killings, so that's a possibility, but the church will be an increasingly besieged and persecuted minority within the United States and the broader Western world. And I think within that broader picture that Dreher paints, we're going to see these churches just dashed against the forces of history. They're not going to be able to survive because they're not built on anything that lasts. We can envision many different ways under which they crack up. We've already seen some of it now in the past few years, past decades, really. And it's going to happen because the same internal contradictions that are destroying the modern world as we see it are destroying the churches, because they have become so closely associated with these assumptions and these beliefs and these expressions of modernity that they are now suffering from the self-destructive tendency of modernity itself. And that's why they won't make it, because they are functionally indistinguishable from these broader forces. And what really needs to happen is a really serious look at what I call the trifecta of Christian text skepticism, or Christian machine age skepticism. C.S. Lewis, in his Abolition of Man and his fictional work, That Hideous Strength, Ivan Illich and Jacques Ellul, they all point to varying degrees the danger of the technological age itself, and how Christians, how it's destructive of normal human life itself, and is self-destructive, and how we need to separate ourselves from it. Right? C.S. Lewis, I think it's God in the Dock, but don't quote me on it, talks about how the only way for a man to be free in a true sense is if he's basically a homesteader, eating food that was raised on his own property, in his own house, on his own property. Because whether it's the state or the corporation, he's the kind of man that is self-sufficient enough and free enough to be able to critique these institutions without feeling like he's biting the hand that feeds them. And so, because these both the whole spectrum of this reformed evangelicalism has bought completely into the assumptions of modernity, they're going to suffer the same destruction that modernity is facing right now, because the same principles are at work. And I think, for starters, revisiting Lewis and discovering Illich and Ellul would be a really good start in at least building a lifeboat to survive what's coming.
Exactly. And I think, as harsh as this is going to sound, I think it really does need to be said. One could make the case that the left wing in America is insane. I think that's obvious, with their ideas of race and gender. It is fairly, I think, if you were to take anybody from the past and bring them to the present and show them the American left, especially somebody from the ancients, they would probably say, yeah, the left wing is definitely insane. But the right wing, I would say at best, is stupid. As bad as that sounds, as harsh as that sounds, I think that's fairly true, because what the right does is that the right, whether they're Christians or otherwise, tend to support things that are ultimately against the values that they claim to hold. Of course, Ted Kaczynski, in his manifesto, dedicates a lot of time to the left and the pathologies of the left, but he does mention in passing that conservatives are fools because, in large part, they think that, well, on the one hand, they claim to be for traditional values, but on the other hand, they will support the very systems and assumptions that undermine traditional values, whether that's, you consider that technology or industrial capitalism or modernity in general, whatever you consider that to be. So, yeah, it shows you that today what is ultimately has led evangelical Christians to this point, going back from the beginnings of the religious right to the present, was this basic deal with the devil, which was this fear of becoming irrelevant in American culture. We were willing to ally with individuals and groups that would promise us to get the judges that we wanted on the Supreme Court, or they will maybe throw us a bone here and there about prayer in schools or what have you. But ultimately, we've been fooled. We've been suckered, and we have not really had anything. If anything, we've traded that for a family that's destroyed, for effective feminism in the church, for decreased birth rates among Christians, to integrating our children into the public school system and colleges, and we're losing our children to the culture anyway, despite our attempts. to avoid that, and that's because we have made it clear that we want to be part of the system, we want to save the system, we want to control the system, and in the end, it's only destroyed us. And so, until we connect the dots when it comes to the issues within the church, and seeing that it all really does go back to the love of money, as Paul said, that the love of money is the root of all evil that enables all of these problems that are just rampant in the church. If we don't really acknowledge that, we're going to hit the wall eventually, if we haven't already.
Yeah. And now that we're nearing the end, I think it's about time to have final statements. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we end this?
As harsh as this is going to sound, I think the Christian right really does need to die. And we've talked about in past streams that the Christian right was absolutely correct on a lot of issues. But the problem is that the Christian right, as you alluded to earlier, made the same Constantinian mistake that, Christians, we ought to be active in society. We ought to try to bring these institutions under Christian control and sanctify them and sacralize them. And even if we're not post-mill, we are all effective post-mills. With that mentality, though, what it only has served is that it has made Christians integrated into the system, and often poorly, but still integrated nonetheless, to the point where the very system that we've been working to save, that we've been working to preserve, is ultimately going to be the same system that's going to spit us out and trample on us. And it is going to go out, unfortunately, I think, with a bang. I think you're right. I think there's going to be some sort of major event like a Calvinist Charlottesville led by somebody like Jeff Durbin. That's going to cause a lot of Christians across the spectrum, whether or not they support it or not, to lose their voice in the marketplace. And I actually think that's going to be a good thing, because I think this is going to force Christians to re-examine themselves, to re-examine their culture, to reevaluate a lot of these things that we've held dear. And hopefully this will lead us to a point where we're going to go back to the Bible, back to discipleship, back to true in-church living that the early church enjoyed, so that we can actually be an effective witness and serve as an antithesis to this world. If we don't, frankly, we're going to deserve the crushing that we're going to get.
Well, thanks again, Master Sanders. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.